So we're in this series called Fight. My sister and I fought a lot. And we fought all the time. Basically, anytime my parents were gone, my sister and I were in some kind of fight. I remember the fights. I remember vividly what the fights were. I remember falling off the back of the couch and biting through my tongue because I was in a fight, avoiding my sister at some point. I remember her running down the hallway and me chasing after her and her slamming her door in her bedroom and me slamming into said door and breaking the door jamb. I remember the time when we were in her bedroom and somehow one of us bumped into her dresser and the ceramic bunny she used as a piggy bank fell off and crashed on the ground and shattered into many pieces. And I remember even more the time we were somehow in the bathroom because we had chased each other into there and one of us was standing on the toilet and the other one was attempting to get at the person standing on the toilet, and the person on the toilet slipped, the foot went into the toilet, and the very precious turtle dove, ceramic turtle dove that was on the shelf, that was my favorite, the one with the wings outstretched, fell not into the toilet, but onto the seat, cracked, and ended up everywhere. Instantly, my sister and I became fast friends as we tried to glue the thing back together. But that's another story for another time. The fights, I remember the fights. I remember my technique went something like this. And her technique was the turtle. You're familiar with the turtle technique, right? I would demonstrate here, but I just don't want to. You lie on your back, hands in the air, and feet doing the same thing, and no one can get you. You're impervious. You're absolutely, it's a standard practice of how to, I hope I'm not giving any children some educational moments on how to avoid fight. But the turtle is a very effective method of defending yourself when there's just no way to get at them. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, I remember the fights. But I don't remember a single one of the causes. Not one. I texted my sister last night, and I was like, Jody, what's the biggest fight we ever had? And she said, probably the one with the turtle dove. And I was like, yeah, that was a big one. And I said, why did we fight? Sent her text back, why were we fighting? What were the causes? And she goes, I don't remember. It was probably something like you were annoying me, and I decided to get you back, and then you tried to get me back, or something like that. And I said, yeah, isn't it funny that we totally don't remember the causes? And she said, yeah, I guess that's the way it goes. Here's the thing. We remember the fights. We don't remember the causes. Why? Because most of our fights are more about the fight than they are about the reason. But there comes a time in every one of our conflicts when we reach that line and we cross the line from the conflict being about something that means something to the conflict being about the conflict, where the only reason we're fighting is because we're fighting. And in the previous fight, you said something, and now I'm upset about that, and so we fight. And the way brothers and sisters fight when they're 10 and 7 is the same way we fight today, just maybe with less of the chasing and less of the turtle and a little bit more of the insidious language or other techniques that we employ. I'm convinced that we need to learn how to fight well. We need to learn how to handle conflict well. And so in this series, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be covering the 5 what I call fight principles. If you're taking notes, go ahead and jot this down. The 5 fight principles, F-I-G-H-N-T. And today we're covering principle F. I think it's going to be interesting. I think these are things, in fact, the principle of me fighting my sister and not remembering the cause is partially what the first principle is all about. We're going to learn about that today. But it's not just today. We're going to cover 4 more in addition to this. And I believe that when I say today's principle, every one of us in this room is going to be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. It totally makes sense. I'm not going to give you principles that are new. I'm going to give you things that we're not doing. We're going to talk from the Bible about things that we all know, but we just haven't been doing. And when it comes time to that moment when we're in a conflict, we're definitely not doing it then. But before we get into the details of today's principle, I feel I need to sort of set the stage for the entire series by letting you know why we're talking about conflict in the first place. And there are three reasons. Three reasons that I think we need to talk about conflict, that I think it's essential. The first reason is very personal to me. I was raised in a church where my dad was the pastor. And you guys know some of that story. I've shared some of those stories with you before. But one of the things that's exceptionally true about my family, maybe this is true about your family, maybe it's true about you, but I'm telling you it's true about my family and it's true about me, okay? We, as a whole family, are the most skilled people on the planet at identifying anything that's wrong. Seriously. If there's something wrong with you, we can find it. If there's something wrong with a situation, we know it. And if there's something wrong with someone else that you know, and you tell us the story about that other person, we know what's wrong with that person too. My family knows what's wrong. I mean, we are just critical of everything. My dad is a Broncos fan, and my sister absolutely hates Peyton Manning with a visceral passion, and it's creating some very interesting conversations around the house. It's very fun for me to call in and just realize my dad has to leave the room while my sister is in the room because he can't talk about the game at all. So anyway, we're like that. Now, I'm bringing that up because my parents would regularly report to me the conflicts that they were in the church. And there were many. My dad being the pastor, every single Sunday, we'd be driving home, and he and my mom would have a conversation from the front seats of the car about the things that were happening in the church. And it went like something like this. Dr. Miller just cannot stand the contemporary music. And we were trying to get him to do the contemporary music. And this was back in what was called the worship wars of like the 80s and the early 90s, when contemporary music was something like this. Bind us together, Lord, bind us together. And then, or make me a servant, kind of da-da-da-da. And then the Dr. Miller music, the classical music, was how great thou art, how great, and that kind of stuff. So we were in this war kind of in our church about what kind of music we want to do, and my parents were clearly on the side of the contemporary, and Dr. Miller was not, and he made everybody know it. And so on Sunday morning, when we did one of those chorusy type of songs, one of the praise songs, after the service, my mom and dad would be talking about how the lady on the piano just would not keep the tempo. She was dragging, and it was slow, and the organ was loud and garishly annoying. And then when the lady on the piano got to a song that she especially didn't like, she'd play it faster. Just getting right through it. And so every single Sunday we'd be hearing the stories of some other conflict. And these are tiny little things. But in the context of that particular church, they were just the bubbles that showed a greater problem all throughout the congregation. 15 years of ups and downs and fights and business meetings that would go till 2 a.m. because someone was upset about something else that someone else was doing. This was the kind of environment that I was raised in. I saw church conflict after church conflict until finally, freshman year in high school, I'm coming back for summer vacation, and the day or two before I fly out to California, I hear my dad tell me that the leaders of the church have asked him to resign. 15 and a half years, and he's relieved to be released from that particular environment. I could get into all kinds of other details about the nature of that conflict and the conflicts that preceded it and all the other kinds of conflicts that were going on, but I made a commitment to myself. If I'm ever involved in a church, we are not going to handle conflict the way this church handled conflict. And so I ended up in Chicago, the pastor of a church there, and for 5 years, we had 5 big conflicts. Every single year, one conflict. And right when we finished one, there was another one that came up, this one conflict. Someone thought that I wanted to change the church constitution, and that was enough to make them really mad at me. And then this other conflict, I had asked one person to be in charge of a particular program, and another person wanted to be in charge of that particular program, and that caused a huge conflict. And there were other kinds of things. And so finally, at the end of 5 years there, my wife and I were praying about starting a brand new church, and a leader in our denomination said, hey, we think you guys are the people to start a new church. And they'd been praying about Lafayette. So we came down to Lafayette and we're like, okay, finally, we're going to start a church, and maybe we won't have to deal with any of this conflict. And I tell you what, we haven't had to deal with most of the conflict. You know why? Because I outrank all of you. Seriously, when you start the church and people come in and they don't like something, they just leave. They just they just go away. So, we have a little bit of that going on for about 5 years. Most of our conflicts have just left out the front or back door, whichever the case may be. So we've been no, that doesn't mean we're handling it well. That just means it doesn't bubble up in the same kind of way as other churches. And I'm convinced that conflict is the number one problem among Christians today. Many of the people who come to this fellowship are here because of a conflict they experienced elsewhere. Some people are running away from a conflict. Some people are separating from a conflict. Some people have resolved that conflict and have decided part of the resolution is to separate. The point is, I think Jesus wants us to handle conflict better than we often do. And I want to show you a couple verses here. This verse comes from Jesus in Mark chapter 10. He says, "Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." And in that context, he's talking about marriage. But you know what? Husbands and wives are not the only thing that God has joined together. God is also joining together a family for himself. And look at this verse in Ephesians 2:15. Many of us think that Jesus came to this earth to die on the cross so that we could be saved, but that's not all of it. His purpose wasn't just to save us. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, the Jew and the Gentile who were separated. Create one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace. God wanted to create a family for himself. Those who were near and those who were far. He wanted to bring them all together to have one family. God is joining people together. And if he is joining us together, let no one separate. Here's another verse to consider from John chapter 17. Jesus is praying on the night before he's crucified. He says, "I've given them the glory." Talking about all of his followers, not just the 12, but you and me eventually. "I've given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one. I in them and you in me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me." Jesus' heart, his number one prayer before he goes to the cross is, "Father, take all of my followers and make them one." Not only those who follow me today, but those who will follow me because of those who follow me today. And those down into the centuries. Make us one. Jesus prays for that. Jesus asks his Father to unify us. And what God unifies, let no human being separate. Here's another verse. Matthew 5:9. Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Here's the thing.